I am going to talk about law specifically. Law laid out to go. To pull it back a bit to episode 0. Truly, law is one of my bigger areas of my podcast. This is one of the foundations that I want to cover where I think I have my niche. So, to truly understand law, I believe you have to go back to the basics, truly the foundations. Only then can you understand it and apply it to real life situations. So that's what we're gonna do today. I brought my book, my first legal course in 2015. It was September 2015. It started. It goes back to philosophy, legal philosophy, and legal theory. I also have an upcoming legal theory class in my next year, so that might expand upon this subject, and maybe some things might have to be done again, but that will be a case for another time. So, like I said, this episode focuses on what law is. So, not necessarily what law should be, what we think law should be, but purely from a positive sense, and that will be explained later in the podcast. Maybe this one, maybe another one. But we're just talking about the law as it is as we learn it in law school. So this one, the book I'm covering now, is one book, number 1 of a 3-part series. This one is basically called something like Outline, and that is quite an accurate statement, an accurate title to describe what the book covers. So, to get into it, first of all, the book says, and it's a bit of a law school cliche, but it's true, law is everywhere. Whether it's contracts, employment contract, labor contract is the same thing, but rental contract, whether you buy a house or a car, it's all contracts. A parking ticket, that's law. Bad service at a restaurant, that's law. It doesn't really matter, but it's all law. Law is all around us. And the thing about law is that it usually slumbers. We don't really notice that it's there. Only when there's a conflict, only when there's a dispute, when we wish to challenge what someone else thinks the law is. Only then does the law really come up front in our imagination and in our lives. So the purpose of law is as it is practiced. The practice of law is to enforce specific claims. Specific claims do we think we have and that somebody else. So there's 3 basic purposes to law. In the first place, it's information. Which rights and obligations do we have, and how can we enforce them? And which rights do other people have? This is one of the important functions of law, because if you go back to feudal times, the absolute rule of the king did not have those sort of certainty of the rules. You just were subject to the whim. But the purpose of law is to say, it's written right here, these are the rules, these are your rights, these are your obligations. So the second purpose is behavior adaptation. So if we know the law, if it's written down somewhere, whether it's a statute, written law, or whether it's more like a court case, unwritten law, not necessarily, but it's more softer law, then we know how to adapt our behavior to that law. That's also important, because like I said, predictability gives us, we can plan our lives that way. And another interesting source that might be valuable for research purposes would be Bruno Leoni. With his book, he really covers the purpose of legal certainty, and that's a book I intend to cover later. The third purpose is to order and control our lives. Our entire life is regulated by law, because without it, society would suffer. I know there are societies without law, without formal legal systems, but they can't usually develop advanced technological enterprises. So I believe that in order to do something like that, we do need law to give us an orderly system out of which the phoenix of technological development can arise. So there's a difference between legal rules and social rules. Social rules, there can be all sorts of things like general social norms, like you just don't do that. That's sort of a general social norm. You have group rules, so if you belong to a certain subculture, might be a very specific rule that will be enforced through ostracism, for instance. You have just moral rules, so fundamental philosophical questions. Though many people disagree about them, but they are, of course, also foundational to law, but they're not law itself. And last, there are professional rules. Think of lawyers and doctors. Those have a very specific collection of professional rules that they're bound by. So what distinguishes these rules from legal rules is that legal rules are enforced through the formal system. But there's a lot of overlap between these rules, because many of the social rules we have, also religious rules like do not murder, do not steal, many of those rules are also legal rules. So law does not exist without a legal system. Legal system is certain rules and institutions. When combined, they order and direct society. There's several purposes of a legal system. In the sociology of law, the following purposes are considered to be purposes of a legal system. Firstly, to create social order, like I said. There have to be predictable patterns of behavior so that we can adapt ourselves to it and we can use it as a foundation to make choices and plans in our lives. Secondly, non-violent conflict resolution. So it's not technically non-violent, of course, because whether it's a state or something else, law usually gets enforced at the point of the gun. We all know that as libertarians, we know that very intimately. But the idea is, and that's a very important one, that the idea of law is that we do not have shootouts in the streets of people stabbing each other, but we go to court, we debate about these things, and then finally there's a ruling. Otherwise you get Hatfield and McCoy-like situations, and those never get resolved. The third is to individual realization. So an individual can only grow and develop as a person if he has certain protections and he has a certain space in which he can move without being violent. Also, scarce goods have to be distributed. This reminds me a bit about Hobbes with his theory about property rights. But yeah, that in order to divide scarce goods, you need something of a system. We prefer private property, but something of a system that says you own this, I own this. This is the boundary. Also to channel social change, whether it's technology, I'm thinking about cloning or big data or any of those sorts of big questions. We need a legal system to figure out what are the implications of these for the behaviors of people. An interesting question, for instance, could be, when do robots actually become the equals of humans? How much sentience do they have to have? And how do we give them legal rights? That might be a question to answer in the future. Now, of course, in the current society, the state holds the monopoly on force. This is the core function of the state. To enforce law is any state that does not enforce law is essentially either a tyranny or not a state at all. So when you look at Montesquieu, of course, there are these checks and balances. Most people probably know that, but to briefly cover it, you have the legislative function, the legislative branch that makes the laws, the judicial branch that interprets and applies them, in specific cases, and the executive branch enforces the laws and executes policy. Now, as many law students might know, this is a bit simplistic because the judicial branch sort of makes law as well as the administrative branch. But that's a topic for another day. So, a legal system, roughly speaking, has three types of norms. You have behavioral norms, that is, for instance, do not murder. These are specific norms regarding specific behaviors. Do not do this, or you are obligated to do this, or you are banned from doing this. And that's when the second rule comes in, the sanctions. So the rule is meaningless without a sanction, whether it's a fine or damages or some other sort of consequence like prison, capital punishment even. Those rules are an essential part of actually enforcing the behavioral rule. And the third rule that you might not have thought about is attribution. Of course, it's a bit more specific to state law, but of course, before someone like a police officer can exercise power, the idea is that this power has always been bound by law. Finally, there are roughly speaking, three aspects of law which are important to look at to determine whether something is actually a legal rule that's binding, that is effective, that, like I said, law that is instead of law that we would like it to be, perhaps law that used to be. So first, positive law. Positive law is what we say when we mean a law that actually applies right now, right here. So I am bound by Dutch law. Dutch law is the positive law of my country that I am bound by. 2018 Dutch law. That is positive law. You can see it in the legislation, etc. Now, of course, justice is an important test for positive law, but positive law itself does not have anything to do with justice. It has much more to do with who are the authorities who make the law. Is it passed through proper legislative measures or not? Valid rules are essentially rules that apply right now, right here, to a specific group of people. So if you think you have a right to something, but it's not actually applicable in the current positive system, then it's not a valid legal rule. The third is a bit more nuanced. It's the effectivity of law. So even if a rule is positive and valid, it may not be that it's actually effectively enforced. So for instance, like I said, if a law is on the books but it's not effectively enforced, that essentially means that the law is not really affecting people's lives. For instance, cannabis, marijuana, weed, whatever you want to call it, it's officially banned in the Netherlands, but there is a toleration policy. So as a matter of fact, it is not really banned in a meaningful way. It's sort of dead letter law, as we might call it. But to sum things up, law is everywhere, and law usually only come into contact with law if we are actually confronted by a dispute. Law has various purposes: information, behavior, adaptation, and to order our lives. Law differs from social rules, but it does have some overlap. The legal system is necessary to fulfill these functions of non-violent conflict resolution, distribution of scarce goods, etc. The state holds the monopoly in almost every society. The state is divided into legislative, judicial, and executive branch. And there are three types of norms that are important to distinguish: behavioral, sanctions, and attribution norms. And norms have to be positive, valid, and effective to be an actual positive rule. So I want to thank you for listening. This was episode 2. If you have any questions, you can reach me on social media. All the links are in the descriptions. And you can also support me financially. Those links will be in the show notes as well. So, thank you very much for listening and see you next week.